Welcome back. In this second video, we will look at the creation story from Genesis. To begin our journey through the Pentateuch, we start with the first book of the Bible, Genesis, or in Hebrew, Bereshit, which means in the beginning, or Genesis means origin or starting point. The book of Genesis is a primarily book of history. It's a historical narrative. Now, I think that there are theological components to it, and we will unpack few themes as we go through them. We must begin by dividing Genesis into two major sessions, and these sessions are in no means meant to divide the book in two halves, because one half or one section is significantly larger than the previous one. But this distinction in Genesis has more to do with the subject of the historical narrative. So Genesis is usually divided into two sections. Chapters 1 through 11 are referred to as primeval history, and chapters 12 through 50 are referred to as patriarchal history. The change here has to do with the moment when God calls Abraham, and Abraham becomes the first patriarch of Israel and gives him the promise that that he will multiply his descendants, and through his seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And from that moment, history goes from looking at events like creation, like the flood, into now following the journeys of a patriarch with his family. And that's where the distinction comes. And so, as you know, it's not really to be two exact halves, it's just two different sections. We begin with creation. And creation is Genesis 1 through 2:28. So, again, because we need to make a distinction between a biblical studies course like this one, in which we'll just look at the background of the text, and a theology course, when we look at a whole system of beliefs, we're not going to get into the whole, are the days of creation really 24-hour periods, or are they longer, and what kind of creation theory we should uphold to. That's part of systematic theology. But it's important that we make a distinction between the two creation accounts, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In Genesis 1 is more cosmological, and Genesis 2 is more anthropological. Here we have a perfect example of when those that uphold the JEDP theory, they will look at the creation chapters and say, this is evidence that a couple of sources were combined together to create a creation narrative, because you have one creation account on chapter 1, and then when you read the creation account on chapter 2, is different. And so they'll say the first one is the Elohist tradition, and the second one is the Yahwist tradition. I'm going to show that we don't have to force a JEDP component to explain the two creation accounts. We must begin by taking note of something particular. It's the way the days of creation are lined up on chapter 1. So we have, in the PowerPoint that you're following, we have here a chart where we have the 7 days. In the first day, he created light. In the second, heavens. In the third, he divided dry earth from the oceans or the waters, and also created edible vegetation. Then we have celestial bodies like the sun and the moon, and stars. Then fish and birds on day 5, land animals and mankind on day 6, and then the Sabbath day of rest on the 7th day. It's interesting how these days are arranged, because on the first 3 days, the things that are created are more of environments. And then on days 4, 5, and 6, things that fill those environments are created. And so lots of possibilities with this. And again, not to get into the debate of which, what theory of creation do we uphold, a 6-day creation theory? Do we uphold theistic evolution or progressive creationism? What we see here, how day 1 just portrays creation, is in this orderly manner. God creates light as a reality, the skies above, and then the earth, he sets it in order, separating dry land from oceans, and already creating some vegetation that eventually will become food for the things that he will create, for the moving, for the creatures that he will bring forth. Celestial bodies are brought in on day 4 to fill in the reality of light. And so what we need to look, again, we're not looking at different creative accounts being spliced together. What we're looking is that God creates the reality of light and then harnesses it into the celestial bodies that we observe. That those celestial bodies rule time as we know it, or become signs for different times of the day. Creates the skies and the concept of water, and then fills them with birds and fish. Then on day 3, separates dry earth and creates vegetation. Day 6, 3 days later, he brings the land animals and mankind that will roam on the dry earth. So that's how we see that. In the first creation account, which by the way spills into the first 4 verses of chapter 2, there is an arrangement, and that arrangement is lyrical and poetic. Genesis 2 is arranged in prose, so we acknowledge that there are 2 creation accounts. We acknowledge that they're different in their style, in somewhat in some of the content, some of the things that they emphasize. But this is not to think that, again, we have a splicing of a Yahwist and the Elohist document, because these 2 accounts are not mutually exclusive. Genesis 1 was probably a later addition, yes. But this later edition was meant to captivate or capture a song of creation paradigm, because Genesis 1 is arranged in lyrical and poetic ways. And hence, you even see the symmetry in how the days of creation are followed or are recorded. Environment, 1, 2, 3, and then creatures or elements that will fill those environments, 4, 5, 6. And so 1 correlates with 4, 2 with 5, 3 with 6, and then the day of rest to culminate. And so what we see here is a cosmological account from God's perspective. And what do we mean by that? It was very common in Mesopotamian myths. Your book, and we will go through some of those a little bit, that there was always cosmological myths, meaning creation stories. How did the world came to be? In every culture, they had elaborate accounts, especially Mesopotamian culture, had different creation accounts where the gods and the deities will create the earth. And a lot of those were composed as a poem, as a kind of like a way to exalt or emphasize the artistry of the deities involved in the creating. Genesis 1 is a later addition, and when I mean later, I don't mean like many centuries later. What I mean is that stylistically it was composed to go at the beginning to create a version of a song of creation, and it's strictly from God's perspective. That's why the creation of humans is just mentioned in Genesis 1:27 in a poetic, rhythmic way, that he created them, man and woman, he created them in his image and likeness. And it is meant to just simply highlight what God did from God's perspective. And in a way, it was a response to Mesopotamian myths and legends of creation. We learn some things about God in that first creation account. God is completely above his creation. And that's very important. Again, when we look at some of the myths, when you read about them in your textbook, you'll see that it's hard to determine what was deity, what was pre-deity, what was created. We don't see that in Genesis 1. God is completely above his creation. Now his spirit is hovering, it's closely in conjunction with the chaos, but it's still distinguishable. And so, in fact, his spirit is above the waters. But in Babylonian myths, the false goddess Tiamat was within the waters. And so you see subtle shots being taken at Babylonian myths. It's like, yes, even God is among the creation, but he's above. He's not in the midst. He's in the midst, but he's still separate. And he keeps it that way. So God is completely above his creation. God is totally separate from his creation. It's very clear. Genesis 1 makes it very clear that what is created is not an extension of God, or wasn't ascribed godhood, or shouldn't be ascribed godhood. In fact, the word for created, or that is translated as creation, is the Hebrew word bara, which is only used to refer by an act of God. The word bara in Hebrew is basically creating out of nothing. And it's only given, or it only shows up with God as the subject of that verb. The work of God here is to direct creation and set it in order. There's never chaos to create more chaos to then finally lead to order, but here is chaos, and God supernaturally and mightily brings it to order. And again, the best way to reflect that is how the days of creation are even arranged. So there's even some meta components in the creation account that refers to how God sort of put everything together. And the most important thing is that there is an emotional interaction. God is not removed emotionally and spiritually from his creation, in that God is actually moved by what he's creating himself. Creation doesn't become a burden to him. or something he's not unconcerned about. He's pleased by what he creates. He's pleased by what he sees. Creation serves God's purpose. And so this organization, this setting up in order, follows an order or a purpose that God has for it. Eventually, it's for the enjoyment of humankind in mind. He's bringing that together. Also, something very, very important to know. Let's just gonna repeat this one. And finally, something important to note in the first creation account is that what we refer to as creation includes space and planet Earth. Even the farthest star was created by God. Planet Earth is at the center of God's plan as the space prepared for humanity to live and relate with God. It might not be the physical center, but it is the spiritual center of God's activity within the created order. So this is not just an earth-centric creation account. This is a cosmic creation account. But it is very clear that the center of God's activity is going to be planet Earth, because that is where He's creating life, in particular humanity. What do we learn about humanity in this first creation account? Is that humanity stands above everything else created. Because whereas He mightily and with one word creates the light, the oceans, the animals, when it comes to humanity, He actually takes the time to create it. And there is more covenantal imagery when it comes to the creation of humanity. There are words being used like fashion and putting and placing them. So there is a deeper relational connection between God and humanity, as opposed between God and the animals or God and the stars. Another thing that we learn about humanity from the first creation account is that humanity is lower than the Creator. And again, this obviously is something that maybe a lot of us made the assumption, but when you look at creation myths from other places, the distinction is not very clear. You have humans with divine abilities. But it's very clear there is a hard distinction. Humanity does bear the image and likeness of God. What that means, and again, we don't want to delve into systematic theology here. What it means is that we reflect attributes of God to a certain degree. We're relational. We can love just like He does. We can speak. We can make our opinion and our ideas known, just like God discloses His ideas and His word to us. So we bear the image and likeness of God in us, in our relationships, and in the makeup of who we are. But at the end of the day, we're not God. And that's made very clear. We can only live because we're recipients of the breath of life. And humanity was created to worship and delight in the Creator. Humanity is given the commandment to subdue the earth. Now, when we're going to deal with that a little bit more later. What does that really mean? But humanity is being given this privilege of being God's representative at this moment in creation. So, it's not just the fact that God takes the time to create us, fashion us from the dirt, puts the breath, His Spirit, to make us living beings, living souls. But there's also the charge or the mandate to be His representative on earth. Image and likeness, if we want to narrow down and zoom in on that for a little bit, image is the word Salem in Hebrew, likeness is the Muth, and these are complementary repetitions. So, it's not really that one thing refers to one concept and then the second one refers to something else. It's that this is complementary repetition, very, very common in the Old Testament style of writing, where the synonyms are meant to be taken as one idea, each just one emphasizes or play off the other. And again, it conveys our dependence and capacity to relate with God and other human beings and relate with other created or with other creatures as well. Any attempt to separate the words and categorize them could lead to some misconceptions. Some say that the image refers to his indescribable attributes and the likeness to his describable attributes, and there's some different theories. Reality is that God is an invisible being, he's undescribable. We shouldn't look at this as or the image is the mental faculties and likeness the spiritual faculties. We don't know. It's better to take the concept as complementary. Image and likeness convey one truth. And as bearer of God's image, we represent God before his creation. So what do we make of other cosmological myths? And this is one of the things that we will look at as a class in our live sessions. And again, because I'm pre-recording some of this ahead of our first class, it might kind of seem a little disconvoluted. But your book, and to be fair, most of Genesis commentaries or books of Old Testament studies usually mention two creation stories from Babylonian mythology. One is the Enuma Elish, and the other one is the Atrahasis epic. And so the details of those stories are there. And so why do they feature in our studies of Pentateuch? And later on for the flood, you might see references to the Gilgamesh epic, another famous Babylonian story, probably the first story ever written, like first story ever produced in a written form. That's how old the Epic of Gilgamesh is. What's the point? Why do we have to look at that? And why do we even look at Genesis 1 as a kind of like a contra or a sanctified version of these myths? In essence, these myths create or gives us a window into what was being believed and taught at the time when the Hebrew priests and teachers of the law were compiling the Hebrew scriptures, were trying to reimagine Judaism after the exile. It also shows us that, in a sense, every culture struggles with the same question, and that just becomes an additional proof that God created everything. Because Ecclesiastes says that he wrote eternity in our hearts. Romans 2 even mention that the Gentiles, those that didn't have the covenants by nature, did or did not things written in the law, because there's an instinct being produced in there. And these creation stories, some of them very similar to Genesis accounts, to the point that has been used by critics to say, you see, the Bible was probably made up and they just took from these myths and created their own version. It's not what is happening here. What it is that in every culture, in every religion, there is a push to recreate those things that seem so beyond us. And the best way that every culture recreates them is by bringing in their gods. And so, what God does through Genesis 1, which again is the later creation account, most likely, is to counter some of the commonalities of these myths. It's important to look at the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis because it shows us the creation stories that were best preserved in Mesopotamia. So when we look at Israel and the Israelites and how they were to be separate from the nations around them, this gives us an example of how the nations around them believed. It gives us a point of reference to discover how different is the concept of God when it is based on biblical revelation. These myths will give an image of the gods that is very contrary to what we know about God in the Bible. It shows us, this is a very good one. This is a very, very important reason, this is number 3. It shows the way human beings make sense of the world around them without the benefit of revelation. We have the benefit of biblical revelation, but if we take that away, how will we try to answer those questions that plague us? How did everything come to be? It's a question that everybody has asked at some point. This myth gives us an idea. This is a way that we try to cope with our limitations. And a very important one, number 4, it paints a picture of the world from which Abraham was called to follow and worship Yahweh. Because Abraham was a Canaanite. Actually, I'll rephrase that. Because Abraham grew up in Ur, in Haran, in these cities that were influenced by Babylonian myths. So the Enuma Elish is something that maybe he was taught. And this is the kind of worldview that he was called out of to follow and worship Yahweh. So it's important to know these myths. We'll stop at here for this one because there's some roundtable questions that obviously what I will just ask you as you see the text on the screen is for you to answer them on your own. You're keeping a journal to write about them, write some thoughts about them. When we come together for our first class, I will assume that you watched these videos and we can start the class with a conversation about this particular question. So we'll just leave it there for a few seconds. And then I look forward to seeing everyone on the third video. Thank you.